The gavel fell with a sound like a dry branch cracking. It was a cheap wooden thing, wielded by a man in a tie that was too tight. He smiled a practiced, satisfied smile. His name was Davies, and he worked for the county. The room was the commission chambers repurposed for the annual tax auction. It smelled of stale coffee and old paper records. A handful of men in polo shirts and clean work boots, the small-time bidders, sat scattered in the wooden pews. They looked at their phones or shuffled their bid sheets. It was the last parcel of the day, Lot 23B, a sliver of land deemed worthless by most, delinquent on its taxes for 7 years. The final bid was $1,200. Sold, Davies announced, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room, to the gentleman in the third row. The buyer, a man with a hopeful expression, nodded and began to pull a checkbook from his jacket. The business of the county was concluding, neat and tidy. Then a voice came from the back, near the heavy oak doors. It was not loud, it was calm, it was measured, but it stopped everything. That parcel doesn't exist. All heads turned. Davies paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before being professionally reassembled. He squinted toward the back. Standing there was an older man. His boots had dust on the toes. His shirt was a plain blue, clean but faded at the collar and cuffs. His hands, weathered and patient, held a long cardboard tube. On the plastic end cap, written in faded black marker, were 3 characters, 77-A. The man in the back did not move forward. He simply stood, a quiet interruption to the flow of official procedure. Davies cleared his throat, his tone shifting from auctioneer to administrator, a tone of gentle, firm correction. Sir, the auction for lot 23B, the Pike Creek sliver, is concluded. The sale is final. He gestured toward the bidder, who was now holding his pen above his checkbook, uncertain. The room was silent. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The man in the back was Arthur Vance. He was 71 years old. He had farmed the same 120 acres his father had farmed before him. He was not a man who came to the county courthouse. His business was with the seasons, with the soil, with the slow and unforgiving logic of rainfall and drought. Davies tried again. His voice layered with the kind of patience one uses for the confused or the belligerent. This is a public auction of tax-delinquent properties, sir. All parcels are listed, verified, and legally offered. Arthur Vance took a slow step forward, then another. The sound of his work boots on the polished linoleum floor was deliberate. He was not angry. He was not agitated. He seemed to be operating on a different timeline from everyone else in the room. He walked past the pews, his eyes fixed on the long table at the front where Davies stood with his files and his gavel. The successful bidder watched him, a look of irritation now mixing with his uncertainty. He had bought a piece of land. He had followed the rules. This interruption was an inconvenience. Davies, for his part, represented the institution. He was the face of the county's authority, an authority built on maps, on ledgers, on digital files that confirmed what was and what was not. His confidence was the confidence of the system itself, a system that had been running this way for 100 years. It did not make mistakes about what it owned. Arthur Vance reached the table. He did not speak. He placed the cardboard tube on the polished wood. The sound was soft, a muffled thud. It lay there, between him and Davies, an object that did not belong in the room. It was old. It was worn. It was an anomaly in a world of fresh printouts and glowing screens. To understand the cardboard tube, you have to go back 3 months, to a notice that arrived in Arthur's mailbox. It was a standard county envelope, windowed and impersonal. It informed him of a pending auction for a delinquent property adjacent to his own, parcel 23B. It listed back taxes owed in the amount of $467. Arthur had stood in his kitchen reading the notice under the bare bulb. He didn't recognize the parcel number. He owned parcel 23. He had paid the taxes on it every year for 48 years, just as his father had for 30 years before that. He assumed it was a mistake, a neighbour's notice sent to the wrong address. He threw it on the pile of mail on his counter and forgot about it. A month later, a second notice arrived. This one was printed on yellow paper. Final notice. He took this one more seriously. The next morning, he drove his old pickup truck the 20 miles into town.
At the county records office, a young woman with a bright, helpful smile looked up his property on her computer. "Yes, Mr. Vance, here you are, parcel 23. She pointed to a large green shape on the screen. "And right here," she said, tapping a tiny, almost invisible red sliver that ran alongside it, "is 23B. It's been on the books for years. Looks like the taxes haven't been paid since 2015. Arthur leaned closer. The red sliver corresponded to a 12-foot wide strip of land along the creek. "That's my land," he said. The clerk's smile didn't change. "The map says it's a separate parcel, sir. Our GIS data is very accurate." He asked to see the old paper maps. The clerk sighed. It was an inconvenient request. The paper records were in the basement archives. It took her 15 minutes to find the key. The archive was a small, windowless room filled with grey metal shelves. The air was cool and dry, thick with the smell of aging paper and binder's glue.
She showed him the large, heavy plat books and left him there alone. For 3 days, Arthur Vance sat at a small wooden table in that basement, turning the massive, brittle pages. He went back, decade by decade. He saw the maps change as the county grew. Roads appeared, subdivisions were carved out of old farms. But the sliver, 23B, was always there on the modern maps, a stubborn little line of red. He knew it was wrong. He didn't know why it was wrong, but he knew it. He could feel it in his bones. On the third day, in a dusty binder from 1978, he found it, a notation scrawled in the margin of a survey update. Per new county grid, parcel 23B re-established for tax roll. Re-established, that was the word, which meant at some point it had been unestablished. He started looking backward from there. He went to the deeds office. He spent another 2 days pulling every deed filed for his section of the county between 1950 and 1960. And there, in a book from 1956, he found the record of a sale. The county selling a vacated service road to his father, John Vance. The price was $47. The deed explicitly stated that the land, formerly designated as a public right-of-way, was to be absorbed into the adjacent parcel 23, its acreage and tax assessment adjusted accordingly. Attached to the deed was a reference, See Survey File 77-A. That 12-foot strip of land was where his father had taken him fishing for the first time. He was 6 years old. His father, John Vance, was a man of few words and strong hands. He had bought the main farm after the war with money he had saved while working in a factory. He was not born a farmer, but he had the patience for it. When the county decided to abandon the old service road that ran along Pike Creek, John saw an opportunity, not for profit, but for permanence. He bought the useless strip of land. Arthur remembered him driving the wooden stakes himself, marking the new boundary. His father had a rule. You don't own what you can't walk. Every spring, after the last frost, they would walk the fence line of the entire farm. It was a ritual. When they got to the creek, his father would point to the line of sycamore trees. "This is ours now," he had said, "all the way to the water. Nobody can build a road here again." It was a promise of stillness, a promise that this one small piece of the world would stay as it was. It wasn't about the value of the land. It was about the integrity of the line. When Arthur was 12, his father gave him his first real job, clearing the brush along that creek bank. It was hard work, thorns and poison ivy, but at the end of the summer his father stood beside him, looking at the clean line of earth. He didn't offer praise. He just nodded. "Good," he said. "Now it's yours to keep." Years later, after Arthur had taken over the farm, his wife Helen had an idea. She loved trees. She ordered 100 poplar saplings from a catalogue. Together, they planted them in a perfect row along that 12-foot strip. It took them a whole weekend. Their hands were sore, their backs ached. "In 20 years," she said, wiping dirt from her cheek, "this will be a wall of green. It'll be our wall." Helen had been gone for 10 years now, but the trees were there. They were 60 feet tall, a living monument to a single weekend of work. Their leaves turned a brilliant yellow every fall. When the wind blew, they made a sound like a rushing river. That strip of land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was a repository of memory. It was the place of his father's promise and his wife's legacy.
The thought of it being sold to a stranger for $1,200, sold because of a clerical error made by someone who had never walked it, was an offence. Not an insult, but a deep structural offence. Like a crooked picture frame or a door that wouldn't close properly. It was something that needed to be made straight. After finding the deed, he went back to the archives and asked for file 77A. The clerk had to look for it in the offsite storage request list. It took a week. When it arrived, it was in a dusty cardboard tube. Inside was the original 1956 survey drawn in India ink on linen. It showed the service road, it showed the main parcel, and it showed, with precise, elegant lines, how the one was to become part of the other. At the bottom was a bright blue octagonal stamp from the county surveyor and a clear signature. It was the proof, not an argument, not a claim. It was the fact of the matter, rolled up and waiting. Back in the commission chambers, the air was thick with the weight of the interruption. Mr. Davies looked at the tube on the table, then back at Arthur. He adopted the tone of a patient teacher. "Sir, I appreciate that you've brought your own records. However, the county operates on the official publicly filed GIS map. That is the legal standard. Our map clearly shows two separate parcels." He gestured to a large monitor on the wall, which displayed the neat, colour-coded grid of the county. "As you can see, 23B is right there." Arthur Vance did not look at the screen. He looked at Davies. "The GIS map is wrong," he said. It was a simple statement. "It's based on a clerical error made in 1978, when the county switched to a new grid system. The transfer from the paper files was incomplete." He gently tapped the end of the tube. "This is from file 77A, the survey that finalized the land transfer in 1956. The mention of the file number, the specific year, the technical language gave Davies a moment's pause. This was not the usual rambling complaint from a disgruntled citizen. This was different. But he had his procedure. He had his authority. "Sir," he began, his voice tightening slightly, "even if there was some historical discrepancy, which I am not conceding, the fact that this parcel has been separately assessed and taxed, or not taxed in this case, for over 40 years establishes a clear record. The county has acted in good faith based on decades of consistent documentation." He was making a legal argument now. He was citing precedent without naming it. He was building a fortress of words, the fortress of the institution. Arthur Vance listened. He waited until Davies was finished. Then he spoke again, his voice just as quiet, just as calm. "The tax was paid," he said. "It was paid as part of my main parcel. When my father bought that strip, the county added the acreage to parcel 23. The tax assessment was adjusted. I've been paying the correct higher tax on the combined land ever since. The county has been collecting the money.
He just forgot what it was for. Davies's face hardened. His professional patience was wearing thin. This was his auction. His authority was being questioned in a public forum. He decided to switch tactics, moving from legalism to a more practical, dismissive approach. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, a small gesture of control. "Look," he said, forcing a softer, more reasonable tone. "I understand this can be confusing. Old records can be complicated. But this sale is final. The new owner," he gestured to the bidder, who was now watching the exchange with undisguised annoyance, "has made a legitimate purchase." He tried to create a sense of shared, sensible reality, a reality in which the auction was a finished fact. He was appealing to the finality of the process. "We can certainly look into correcting the records for the future," he offered, a meaningless concession. "But as for today, this transaction is complete." Arthur Vance gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He didn't argue the point. He didn't debate the finality of the sale. He simply presented a more fundamental truth. "He can't own what the county didn't have to sell." The sentence hung in the air. It was simple. It was absolute.
It bypassed all of Davies's procedural arguments and went straight to the heart of the matter: ownership. The logic was inescapable. The buyer looked from Arthur to Davies, his brief flicker of ownership now extinguishing. Davies felt the ground shifting. He was losing control of the room. He made one last attempt, a final appeal to practicality, the last refuge of a failing argument. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Sir, let's be realistic here. We are talking about a 12-foot wide strip of overgrown creek bank. It has no access. You can't build on it. The appraisal value is less than $2,000. He spread his hands in the gesture of magnanimity. "This is not worth the fuss. The county is prepared to be reasonable. We can discuss a settlement, some form of compensation for the misunderstanding." He was offering money. He assumed this was, at its core, about money. He believed every problem could be reduced to a number on a check. This was the deepest failure of his understanding. "It's not about the money," Arthur said. The three arguments had failed: the legal theory, the procedural appeal, the financial settlement. Each had been met with a short declarative sentence, a sentence that didn't debate the premise, but simply replaced it with a more solid one. Davies was out of arguments. He was left standing in the silence, his authority dissolving. The room watched, waiting. The institution had been challenged by an old man with a cardboard tube, and the institution had blinked. From the side of the room, a figure stirred. Margaret Haskins, the county clerk. She was a woman in her late 60s with grey hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had worked for the county for 43 years. She had seen officials like Davies come and go. She had been sitting quietly through the entire auction, handling the paperwork. She had watched the exchange without expression. Now she walked forward. Davies, seeing her approach, saw a potential ally, an institutional heavyweight. "Margaret," he said, his voice laced with relief, "perhaps you can clarify for this gentleman. Our GIS maps are the official record, are they not?" Margaret did not look at him. Her attention was on the cardboard tube. She walked to the table and looked down at the faded black letters on the end cap. 77A. A flicker of something, not quite recognition, but a deeper kind of procedural memory crossed her face. She looked at Arthur. "Does it have a blue stamp?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, raspy from years of disuse. Arthur nodded. He twisted the plastic cap, the dry plastic groaning. He carefully slid the rolled-up document out. It was a sheet of draftsman's linen, yellowed with age, brittle at the edges. He unrolled it on the table. The black India ink lines were still sharp and clear.
The elegant cursive script of the surveyor was perfectly legible.
There, in the bottom right corner, was a bright blue octagonal stamp.
Margaret leaned over, putting on her glasses. She traced one of the property lines with a gnarled finger. She read the surveyor's notes in the margin. She nodded to herself, a small, private confirmation. Then, without a word, she turned and walked to a set of large grey metal filing cabinets against the far wall. They were relics from a pre-digital age, filled with records the county no longer consulted but had never thrown away. She pulled open a heavy drawer labelled Resolutions, 1950 to 1960. The drawer groaned in protest. She ran her finger along the tabs of the thick binders within, finally pulling one free. It was heavy. She carried it back to the table and laid it open. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the rustle of the thick pages as she turned them. She was moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. She was not rushing. She was consulting the source code of the county's history.
She found the page she was looking for. She ran her finger down a list of resolutions. She stopped.
She looked at the survey map on the table. She looked back at the entry in the book. She took off her glasses. She looked up, not at Davies, not at Arthur, but at the entire room. She was no longer just a clerk. She was the memory of the institution itself, the final arbiter. "The gentleman is correct," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Parcel 23B was vacated by county resolution on October 11th, 1956. The resolution merged it with Parcel 23. The tax map was never updated correctly in the 78 transfer." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "It's a ghost parcel. It hasn't legally existed for 66 years. The declaration landed in the room with the quiet finality of a closing door. Davies stood, his mouth slightly open. The colour had drained from his face.
His confidence, his polished authority was gone, replaced by the pale shock of a man who has discovered the foundation he stands on is hollow. He looked at the map, at the open binder, at Margaret, as if trying to find some flaw in the sequence of events. There was none. The truth was there, written in ink and confirmed in the official record. The buyer in the third row let out a quiet sigh of defeat. He closed his checkbook and put it back in his pocket. His small dream of a speculative investment had vanished. He wasn't angry, just resigned. He looked at Arthur, not with animosity, but with a kind of grudging respect. Davies finally found his voice, though it was now thin and strained. "Well," he stammered, "this is a highly unusual procedural irregularity." He turned to the clerk who handled the payments. "Void that transaction." He then addressed the buyer directly. "Sir, my sincere apologies. We will, of course, refund your payment immediately. Perhaps we can find you another parcel." It was an attempt to regain control, to manage the situation, to reduce it back to a simple administrative task. He then turned to Arthur. "Mr. Vance," he said, the name coming to him for the first time. "My apologies for the county's error. We will get the records corrected immediately to reflect the proper ownership." He was offering to fix the problem, to make things right. He was trying to close the file. But Arthur Vance said nothing. His part in the conversation was over. He had presented the fact. The fact had been verified. There was nothing left to discuss. While Davies was speaking, Arthur had begun to carefully, methodically, roll the old linen survey back into a tight cylinder. His weathered fingers moved with a practiced gentleness, careful not to crack the aging document. He was not looking at Davies. He was not looking at anyone. His focus was entirely on the object in his hands. The act of rolling up the map was his response. It was a quiet refusal of any further engagement. There would be no negotiation, no settlement, no discussion of compensation. The matter
was not being settled. It had been corrected. The resolution was silence. Arthur slid the rolled map back into its cardboard tube. He pressed the plastic cap on, ensuring it was secure. He picked the tube up from the table. The business of the day was fragmenting around him. The buyer was at the clerk's desk, watching his check get torn in half. Davies was on his phone, his back to the room, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone, likely in the county's legal department.
The other bidders, sensing the event was over, were gathering their papers and filing out, whispering to one another. There was no victory speech, no gloating, no "I told you so." Arthur had not come for a confrontation. He had come to correct a line on a map. The line was now corrected. He turned and walked toward the exit, his boots making the same steady, deliberate sound on the floor. He moved with the unhurried pace of a man who has finished a long day's work. The other people in the room were just details, the machinery of a system that had, for a moment, run off its rails. He had simply put it back on track. As he reached the heavy oak doors, he paused. He looked down at the cardboard tube in his hand. The old leather strap that he had fashioned for it years ago was a bit loose. He stopped, placed the tube on a nearby bench, and carefully tightened the buckle by one notch. He tested it, ensuring it was snug. It was a small, precise action, a final adjustment. Then he picked it up and walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving the quiet chaos of the commission chambers behind him. The institution would fix its records. The lawyers would talk. The digital maps would be redrawn. But for Arthur Vance, it was already done. The crooked thing had been made straight. Late that afternoon, Arthur walked the strip of land by the creek. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the row of poplar trees his wife had planted. A gentle wind was moving through the leaves, making their signature sound, like the whisper of a river. He walked the full length of the parcel, from the old county road to the bend in the creek, his boots leaving faint impressions in the soft earth. He was walking the line. He stopped beside one of the largest trees, its bark thick and deeply furrowed. He placed his palm flat against it. He could feel the solid, living presence of it, a life that had grown from a sapling he and Helen had put into the ground with their own hands. He wasn't thinking about the auction, or about Mr. Davies, or the county. He was thinking of the weight of the sapling in his hands, the smell of the damp earth, the sound of his wife's laughter when she'd stumbled over a root. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the tree, as the light began to fade. Some things are not owned. They are kept. John Vance had bought a boundary. His son had tended it. Arthur Vance's fight was for a line drawn in 1956. Next time, we meet a woman in Oregon whose battle is over a single word written on the back of a photograph in 1922. A word that could save a forest or lose it forever. Stay with us.